was a gloriously bright afternoon in the village of Lydney Parva, the kind of warm, golden June day that seemed tailor-made for a garden fete. Sunlight spilled like honey across neatly trimmed hedgerows and flinty stone cottages adorned with scarlet geraniums. The vicarage lawn buzzed with villagers in their best summer hats, holding teacups in one hand and balancing cake plates in the other, all under bunting that fluttered with a slight breeze. To the untrained eye, it was the picture of English tranquility, smiling neighbours exchanging pleasantries, stalls selling homemade jam and knitted tea cosies, and children bobbing for apples in a barrel. But to Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly under a striped parasol near the hydrangea bush, it was an ideal place to observe the intricate tapestry of village life, where the threads of gossip, envy, affection and resentment wove their subtle patterns. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes moved gently from face to face, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She didn't speak much, but her ears were as finely tuned as a cat's, and it was not long before something peculiar reached them. From across the green came a voice, low, urgent, unmistakably male, though oddly unfamiliar. It issued from the direction of the old stables, now used as storage for fete supplies. "Not here, we agreed. Not today," the voice said. There was a note of panic in it, muffled by distance but unmistakable in tone. Miss Marple's needles paused. The voice didn't match any she recognized, and in a village like Lydney Parva, that was rare. She turned her head ever so slightly, just in time to see a figure emerge from the stable doorway. A woman in a pale yellow sundress, her face flushed. She glanced back before rejoining the crowd, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Miss—" Marple recognized her at once. Margot Philpott, newly arrived from London and staying with her cousin, Mrs. Harriet Longbourn. Margot was fresh-faced, fashionably aloof, and until now seemingly unattached to village life. That she had already discovered a need for secrecy, well, that was noteworthy. Just then the voice of Reverend Chiswick, cheery and booming, broke through the quiet between Marple's ears. "Thank you all for coming. And now, if I may introduce our guest of honor, the celebrated radio dramatist Mr. Harold Staveley." Polite applause scattered over the lawn as a tall man with a trimmed beard and overly crisp blazer stepped onto the makeshift platform. Harold Staveley smiled, raised a modest hand, and gave a short but charming thank you speech, thick with clever turns of phrase. Yet as he spoke, Miss Marple's brows knit for a fraction of a second. Something about that voice familiar, but not quite right. An hour later, the fete carried on with its raffles and strawberry scones, but a ripple of unease had begun to spread. At the edge of the green, near the prize-winning dahlias, Mrs. Beatrice Clegg, the florist's widow, was found collapsed beside the garden bench. At first it seemed fainting from heat, but when the doctor was summoned and the crowd cleared, a cry rose up from Reverend Chiswick. "Dear Lord, she's dead!" The fete was over. Miss Marple stood quietly, her knitting forgotten, her eyes again on the old stable door, and on Margot Philpott, whose calm face had suddenly gone rigid with something that looked far too close to fear. The sun, once so golden and carefree above Lydney Parva, had slipped behind a gauze of clouds by the time Dr. Edgeworth closed his black bag with a sombre click. A hush had settled over the vicarage lawn, as if the birds themselves had drawn back from the hedge to listen. Mrs. Beatrice Clegg, her head now covered respectfully by a linen cloth, lay still upon the bench, the bloom of life gone from her cheeks. The villagers, previously busy with sponge cakes and tombola tickets, had gathered into clusters of murmurs and handkerchiefs. Reverend Chiswick, who had been attending to a visibly shaken Miss Eliza Brent, who claimed to have seen Mrs. Clegg only moments before her collapse, stood pale and uncertain beside the makeshift platform. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, had already taken a few steps toward the scene. She didn't push, nor did she speak. She simply stood, the knitting abandoned in her handbag, her expression one of quiet concentration. It wasn't heat, Dr. Edgeworth said grimly, addressing the vicar and the constable who had just arrived, young Tom Harwood. Her colour, the stiffness already setting in, it was too sudden, and there's a scent, almonds, faint, but unmistakable. Cyanide, the constable asked, more breath than voice. Edgeworth nodded. Likely. I'll know more when I examine her properly, but we must assume as much for now. She did not die naturally. A shiver ran through the small crowd. Who would want to poison Beatrice Clegg? Whispered Mrs. Farnsworth, gripping her husband's sleeve with fingers like bird claws. She never hurt a soul. Oh, nonsense, murmured Mrs. Louise, Jenkins' eyes darting. She had a sharp tongue when it suited her. And didn't she have some business about the ownership of her late husband's flower shop? There was a cousin, I think, who contested the will. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the speaker, but she said nothing. That was not the detail that had caught her attention. No, her thoughts were still returning to that voice, the one that had emerged from the stable just before the death. Urgent, desperate, and wholly unlike the smooth, practiced tones of Harold Staveley. And yet, something similar had curled around the edges of Staveley's vowels when he spoke on the platform. Not the same pitch, but a proximity in cadence. She turned slightly and noted Margot Philpott again. The young woman now stood apart from the crowd, her arms folded tightly, her chin lifted too high for comfort. There was something brittle in her posture, like spun sugar on the verge of snapping. By evening, the fete had been disbanded, and the once lively vicarage lawn had returned to stillness, marked only by trampled grass and the faint scent of scones lingering in the air. Miss Marple declined Reverend Chiswick's offer to walk her home. Instead, she took a slow route through the churchyard, her mind weaving, as it always did, not with wild suspicions, but with threads of human behaviour. And it was there, among the ancient stones and quiet whispers of leaves, that she found something strange. Near the rear gate, where the vicarage grounds gave way to the path that led to the stable outbuilding, a faint glint caught her eye. She stooped carefully and picked up a small object, a lipstick capped and elegant, its casing gold and expensive-looking. A lady's cosmetic, of course, but the shade, deep garnet, was far too bold for most of Lydney Parver's modest residents. Miss Marple, ever precise, pocketed it with the softest murmur of interest. The next morning arrived with drizzle and the sharp scent of damp earth. The village awoke with eyes wide and tongues looser than ever. At the grocer's, two women spoke in low voices over bags of seedless grapes. They say it's murder now. Poison, just like in a novel. And her poor niece just arrived too, imagine. Poor girl. Only been here a week and now this. Had to identify the body, can you believe? Miss Marple didn't join in. She collected her small bundle of lavender biscuits and made her way to the post office, where she was told that Miss Philpott had sent a telegram late the previous night. London address, said Mr. Cribble, who could never resist sharing. Strange too. Regret delay. Must reconsider. B. No name, no full stop. Just that. Miss Marple offered a gentle nod and went on her way. Later that day, an inquest was formally announced. Constable Harwood had begun asking questions, but already the weight of assumption was pressing heavily upon one person. George Haskins, the E.O. gardener's son. It was known, quite loudly and often, that young George had once tried to court Mrs. Clegg's niece, Celia, and been rebuffed. Worse, Mrs. Clegg had reportedly made a great fuss about him loitering near the flower shop after hours. According to Louise Jenkins, who seemed determined to supply as many helpful theories as the village would allow, Mrs. Clegg had even threatened to report George to the police for stealing a crate of begonias last spring. Plenty of motive, wouldn't you say? She told Reverend Chiswick over tea. Young men these days, they hold grudges. And George, well, he has that temper, doesn't he? Reverend Chiswick looked pained. He also sings in the choir every Sunday, and took the trouble to build Mrs. Clegg's garden trellis by hand, which proves nothing, Louise said firmly. Miss Marple listened, sipping weak Earl Grey, her gaze drifting to the rain tracing narrow rivulets down the window pane. She said little, though her thoughts were hardly at rest. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the flower shop, now shuttered and still. Celia Clegg opened the door with reddened eyes and a stained apron. "Miss Marple," she said. "I'm sorry, we're closed." "I understand," said Miss Marple gently. "I won't stay long. I merely wondered, did your aunt often carry lipstick in her handbag? Something bold, perhaps?" Celia blinked, surprised. "No, Aunt Beatrice didn't wear makeup. She thought it unseemly for a woman past 60. Why?" "No reason, Miss," Marple said pleasantly, and she thanked the girl and departed. At supper, she prepared her usual modest meal, but her mind remained restless. She took out the lipstick from her handbag and examined it again. There, in the narrow groove of the cap, was a small smudge, faint but unmistakable. Red wool. And Miss Marple distinctly recalled that Margot Philpot's sundress had a delicate crochet shawl of crimson draped over her shoulders the day before. That night, a figure moved quietly under cover of dusk to the stables. Inside, hidden beneath the dusty tarpaulin and unused fete banners, a small brown bottle with a cracked label lay nestled in straw. Miss Marple wasn't there to see it, of course, but she would soon learn of it, and what she would notice. What no one else had thought curious at all was that Mrs. Clegg never touched sweets. She'd once said they upset her digestion. And yet, according to multiple witnesses, she had accepted a chocolate from a small box on the bench not moments before her collapse, a chocolate no one else could recall bringing, except perhaps one person. A person whose voice didn't match their face. The next morning brought a crispness to the air that had been absent the previous day, as though the very sky were drawing in its breath. In Lydney Parva, the rhythm of life resumed with practiced precision, but the undercurrent of unease pulsed more deeply than ever. Doors opened with more cautious glances, and even the bird-song seemed muted beneath the weight of speculation. Miss Marple, ever punctual, returned from her usual walk with the Daily Clarion tucked under her arm and her gloves folded neatly in her palm. She was met at her garden gate by Constable Harwood, his expression a mixture of duty and discomfort. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap, "might I trouble you for a few minutes?" She offered a pleasant nod and invited him inside. He stood awkwardly in her small parlour as she prepared tea, his eyes skimming the neatly arranged bookshelf and lace-edged cushions as though uncertain where to begin. "I've spoken with Miss Philpot," he said finally. "She claims she was never near the stables yesterday, nor did she see or hear anything out of the ordinary before the incident." "Did she mention her shawl?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Harwood blinked. "Her shawl?" "The red one. It was quite a vivid hue. One might notice if it caught on something. Perhaps a fence nail or a stable latch." "She didn't say anything about it being damaged, if that's what you mean," he said cautiously. "Is it important?" Miss Marple smiled faintly and poured the tea. "Oh, perhaps not. But you know, people often forget small things when they're trying to recall a larger picture. Details slip, like thread from a needle." Harwood looked unconvinced, but jotted something down in his small notebook regardless. "And the lipstick?" Miss Marple asked as she passed him a cup. "Did she recognize it?" He frowned, said it wasn't hers, nor did she know anyone who used that particular brand. "Quite fancy," she said. "I see," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea. She asked no more, and Harwood soon took his leave, thanking her politely and promising to keep her informed. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. By mid-morning, the village had begun to buzz with a new development. The police, having searched the stable more thoroughly, had indeed discovered the small brown bottle, nestled behind a crate of fete supplies and hastily covered by torn bunting. Though the label was damaged, there was enough left to identify the bottle as having once contained potassium cyanide, a compound used, among other things, in metal cleaning and certain types of insect control. Certainly not the sort of thing one stumbled upon casually. Miss Marple learned of this from Mr. Denby, the grocer, who had heard it from young Milly Thorne, who in turn had overheard her cousin, one of the constable's assistants, mention it on the green. "It's all quite dreadful," Mr. Denby said gravely. "To think someone brought that to a fete. In a churchyard." "And it was found in the stable, you say?" Miss Marple asked, selecting a tin of condensed milk. "Behind the bunting. They say it was covered on purpose." "How curious," she said softly. "One wonders why anyone would hide such a thing unless they expected someone might look." As the day wore on, suspicion continued to swirl around George Haskins. Someone, Miss Jenkins again, predictably, had insisted she saw him near the stable before the festivities began, and that he had looked furtive. Furtive, Miss Marple reflected, was a word Lydney Parver enjoyed immensely, though rarely applied with any consistency. Still, George had no clear alibi for the time of Mrs. Clegg's death. He admitted to stepping out for air shortly before the announcement began and had returned just after the commotion. He claimed he hadn't heard anything unusual, but as Miss Marple well knew, people often missed the most remarkable things when they believed nothing remarkable was about to happen. The matter of the chocolates was the next to be examined. Celia, when asked, insisted she had not brought any to the fete, nor had her aunt consumed sweets regularly. Several witnesses, including Reverend Chiswick, recalled seeing a small box of them beside Mrs. Clegg on the bench, yet no one could say exactly who had offered them. Miss Marple, quietly persistent, began inquiring elsewhere. At the stationer's, she learned that a single box of imported French truffles had been purchased 2 days before the fete by a woman with a bit of red about her. The description was vague, and the clerk could not recall whether the buyer had been young or old, tall or slight. "But she had red on her," he repeated firmly. "Red nails or red hat, something like that." It was perhaps not much, but to Miss Marple it was another stitch in the tapestry. Later that day she called on Celia Clegg again. The girl answered the door with circles beneath her eyes and a guarded manner. Still she allowed Miss Marple into the sitting room. "Won't take much of your time, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I merely wanted to ask, did your aunt have any disagreements of late? Someone she quarrelled with, perhaps over money or business?" Celia hesitated, glancing at the closed parlour door before replying. She had words with Mr. Staveley a few days ago." "Oh? Yes?" "He was inquiring about an investment she'd promised, something to do with a publishing project of his. She told him she'd changed her mind, said the man he was working with had a bad reputation in town, and she didn't want her name tied to anything shady." "Did she seem afraid?" Celia bit her lip. "Not afraid, just firm. Aunt B was always direct when she made up her mind." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you happen to see Mr. Staveley at the fete?" "Only briefly. He was performing, wasn't he? Though I thought his voice was different from when he came to the house. I suppose he was using a stage voice." "Quite." As she left the house, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled once again to the voice she had heard, urgent, unpolished, real. She now wondered whether it had, in fact, belonged to someone pretending to be Staveley, or perhaps someone rehearsing with his script. A local actor, a mimic, or simply someone nervous and out of place? And what of the lipstick, the box of chocolates, the red wool? Each clue individually unremarkable, yet together they hinted at something altogether deliberate, calculated. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short letter and sealed it carefully. It was addressed to an acquaintance in London, a former housekeeper who now worked in an agency that provided staff to the theatrical community. A discreet inquiry, she thought, might illuminate something rather useful. Outside, the village dipped into the hush of night, unaware that in a few short days, the face behind the voice and the hand behind the poison would come into clearer view. But not yet. For now, Miss Marple waited and listened, and quietly, as always, she began to knit. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, familiar, yet tinged with tension, as Lydney Parva's villagers exchanged whispers over morning bread and evening firesides. The fete, once a symbol of communal cheer, now cast a shadow that stretched far beyond the stables, where Mrs. Beatrice Clegg had met her untimely end. Miss Marple found herself increasingly drawn into the intricate web of village life, where every smile seemed to mask an unspoken thought, and every casual glance concealed a carefully guarded secret. Her gentle probing at the Clegg residence had unearthed more questions than answers, and the mysterious disparity between the man's voice and the face Miss Marple had glimpsed lingered heavily in her mind. On a mild Wednesday afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mr. Philip Staveley at his modest home near the village green. The man was known for his theatrical flair and occasional local performances, a fixture in Lydney Parva's modest cultural circle. He greeted her with a somewhat theatrical bow, his dark eyes bright with curiosity, though they held a trace of wariness beneath their sparkle. "Miss Marple, a pleasure as always. To what do I owe this visit? Have my humble talents been found wanting?" he said, half joking, but with a faint edge of defensiveness. She smiled kindly, lowering herself into the parlour chair as she unfolded her parasol with slow deliberation. "Mr. Staveley, I wonder if you might indulge an old friend's curiosity. I've been pondering the fate, and in particular, the curious remark that your voice seemed different on the evening of the tragedy." He laughed softly, but it did not reach his eyes. "Ah, yes, well, one must employ all manner of vocal tricks when performing, Miss Marple. Projection, modulation, a certain affectation, it's part of the craft." "Indeed," she agreed, her eyes narrowing gently. "But I heard someone near the stables just before the incident who spoke in a voice that was less practiced, more raw. It struck me as uncharacteristic of you." He stiffened ever so slightly. "Near the stables, you say?" "I was with several friends throughout the afternoon, rehearsing lines for the evening's performance. I assure you, no voices, but mine were present." Miss Marple inclined her head, her mind weaving through the possibilities. "Is there anyone who might have had access to your script, perhaps? Someone familiar enough with your performance to imitate your voice?" Mr. Staveley hesitated, then gestured toward a small bookcase lined with playbills and worn scripts. "My understudy, Douglas Mayhew, has been with me for nearly 2 seasons. A promising young man, though somewhat unreliable." "Unreliable in what sense?" "He has a tendency toward flitting between engagements and tends to borrow more than he returns." He tapped his fingers on a nearby table. "Though I suppose it's not impossible that he might have rehearsed in places unbefitting a proper actor." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled faintly. "Might I meet this Douglas Mayhew?" "I believe he's in London at the moment performing in a small production, but he often returns to Lydney Parva on weekends." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Harcourt, the village seamstress, a woman of practical mien but sharp eyes. "Excuse me, Mr. Staveley, Miss Marple," she said briskly. "I heard you speaking about young Douglas. I saw him yesterday just outside the post office. He seemed rather agitated, pacing back and forth and muttering to himself." Mr. Staveley frowned. "That does not sound like the stable rehearsals I recall." Mrs. Harcourt nodded. "No, it wasn't. And I noticed he had a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, roughly tied. It looked as though it had been handled rather roughly." "Did you see what was inside?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Only a glimpse. Something long and slender, perhaps a rolled-up script, or, well, I can't be sure." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Harcourt and made a note to speak with Douglas Mayhew when the opportunity arose. As she left Mr. Staveley's home, she felt the first real threads of the puzzle begin to come together. The shadow of the understudy, the mysterious parcel, the voice that didn't match the face. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village post office, where she found young Milly Thorne arranging letters behind the counter. Milly's youthful energy had a way of brightening even the dullest corners of the village, but today her smile was taut, and her eyes flickered with nervousness. "Good afternoon, Milly," Miss Marple said with warmth. "I hear you saw Douglas Mayhew recently." Milly nodded, her fingers tightening around a stack of envelopes. "Yes, ma'am, he was acting strange, kept looking over his shoulder like he thought someone was following him." "Did he say anything?" Milly shook her head. "No, but he kept clutching that parcel I told Mrs. Harcourt about. When I asked him what it was, he just muttered that it was important and to keep away." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "And did you notice anything else unusual about him? Anything that might help me understand?" Milly glanced toward the door as though expecting someone, then lowered her voice. He was wearing a jacket that looked far too large for him, like it was borrowed. And his hands were quite dirty, as if he'd been handling something rough or grimy. The pieces began to fall into place in Miss Marple's mind. The large jacket, the parcel, the voice that didn't quite fit the man. There was something about Douglas that suggested a man out of place, perhaps someone trying to assume a role that wasn't truly his. She thanked Milly and stepped out into the fading afternoon light, her thoughts already turning to what the parcel might contain. Was it a prop, a weapon, or perhaps something more sinister? And why had Douglas seemed so desperate to keep it hidden? As the sun dipped behind the rolling hills, Miss Marple returned home to find a letter waiting on her doorstep. The handwriting was delicate and precise, immediately recognizable as that of her former housekeeper, Mrs. Collins. The letter confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Douglas Mayhew was indeed a known figure in the London theatrical scene, notorious for his occasional trouble with the law and a penchant for disguises. More intriguingly, Mrs. Collins mentioned a recent scandal involving Douglas. He had been dismissed from a reputable company after accusations of theft and deception, though nothing had ever been proven. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her fingers tracing the elegant script. Here was a man with motive and means, a man capable of duplicity, who had come to Lydney Parva carrying secrets and perhaps danger. The village clock chimed 8 as Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and prepared a pot of tea. Outside, the stars began to appear one by one, silent witnesses to the unfolding mystery. Tomorrow, she thought, would require a visit to the stables again, and perhaps a discreet conversation with Douglas Mayhew himself, if he could be persuaded to speak. Until then, the voice that didn't match the face echoed softly in her mind, a riddle waiting to be solved in the quiet corners of Lydney Parva. The morning mist clung softly to the hedgerows as Miss Marple set out toward the stables once more, the parcel and the shadow of Douglas Mayhew lingering heavily in her thoughts. The village, still reeling from the shock of Beatrice Clegg's death, had settled into a cautious quiet, but beneath the surface, currents of unease and suspicion flowed briskly. Miss Marple knew well that such moments were when the true nature of people revealed itself, not in grand gestures, but in small, overlooked details. The stable yard was peaceful in the early hour, the scent of hay mingling with the cool dampness. Thomas, the stable hand, was already busy grooming a bay mare, his broad shoulders moving methodically. He nodded in greeting, the creases around his eyes deepening with a faint smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. Back again, I see." "Yes, Thomas," she replied warmly. I wonder if you might spare a moment for a few questions. He set down his brush and wiped his hands on a rag. Of course. Anything to help. I'm curious about Douglas Mayhew. Did you notice anything unusual about him on the day of the fete? Or since then? Thomas frowned thoughtfully. Well, now you mention it, he did come by twice that day, once in the morning, looking quite agitated, and again just before the commotion with Mrs. Clegg. Agitated how? Jittery, like a man who's got something weighing on his mind. He kept looking over his shoulder and muttering to himself. Thomas glanced around as if expecting someone to overhear. I saw him slip into the tack room with a small parcel wrapped in brown. Paper! Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. And what became of this parcel? I didn't see it again, but when the police came after the incident, the tack room was searched. Nothing suspicious was found. But, Thomas hesitated, the parcel was gone by then. A missing parcel, a man acting strangely, it all fit. A pattern. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the fragments she had gathered. Douglas's troubled past, the mysterious package, the voice that didn't match the face. Was Douglas trying to conceal something vital? Or was he himself a victim of circumstance? As she turned to leave, a figure approached from the edge of the yard, a slender man with quick, darting eyes and a nervous energy that seemed to ripple in the air. Douglas Mayhew, Miss Marple, he greeted with a forced smile, wiping dirt from his hands on his jacket sleeve. I was hoping I might have a word with you. Miss Marple regarded him calmly, inviting him to speak. I realize my behavior has been unusual, Douglas began, glancing around nervously, but I swear I had nothing to do with Mrs. Clegg's death. I've been running from trouble, yes, but not that kind. Trouble of what sort? Miss Marple inquired softly. Debt, mostly. Old debts from London, and a reputation I'm trying desperately to leave behind. I came here to start fresh, but the past has a way of catching up. His voice wavered slightly. And the parcel you carried that day? Miss Marple pressed gently. Douglas swallowed hard. A script. A very old script I was hoping to get published. I feared it might be stolen or destroyed by those who don't want me to succeed. It meant a great deal to me. Miss Marple sensed the truth in his words, though there was more beneath the surface. And did you have any quarrel with Mrs. Clegg? He shook his head vehemently. No, she was kind to me. We spoke a few times, mostly about village life and theatre. I admired her spirit. Just then, footsteps approached. It was Inspector Craddock, the local policeman, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense demeanour. Miss Marple, may I have a word? Miss Marple nodded and stepped aside as Craddock spoke quietly to Douglas, his tone low but firm. After a moment, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. We've been reviewing the witness statements. Douglas Mayhew is the obvious suspect, given his behaviour and presence near the scene. But there's a complication, and that is, we received a report from the village pub. Several patrons noticed a man leaving the stables shortly before the incident. He was described as tall, wearing a dark coat, and his voice was unfamiliar, gruff, not at all like Douglas's. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with interest. A man with a gruff voice. Did anyone recognize him? Not exactly, but the description doesn't match any of the regular villagers. We're trying to identify him. Douglas looked troubled. I don't know who that could be. I was alone most of the afternoon, except for rehearsals. Miss Marple pondered the new information. The gruff voice could mean another presence, a hidden player in this drama. The mysterious figure who might hold the key to unraveling the tangled threads of jealousy, betrayal, and fear that had gripped Lydney Parva. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the village pub herself, a cosy place filled with the warm smell of wood smoke and the faint clatter of glasses. She spoke quietly to the bartender, Mr. Evans, a man who knew every whisper in town. Mr. Evans, Have you heard anything about a stranger lurking near the stables that day? Evans nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. A few of the regulars mentioned a tall man in a dark coat. Didn't look like he belonged here. Said he was asking about Mrs. Clegg, too. Odd chap he was. Did anyone describe his face or voice? A voice like gravel, Evans said, mimicking a rough sound. And a face that seemed set hard, like a man with nothing to lose. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward, connecting this stranger to the voice that did not match the face she had noticed earlier. Could this man be the true murderer, someone intent on hiding behind misdirection? The sun was setting as Miss Marple walked home, her mind alive with possibilities. The parcel, the understudy's troubles, the gruff stranger, all these pieces created a mosaic too complex for a hurried conclusion. She resolved to visit the post office once more the following day to follow up with Millie Thorne, and perhaps catch a glimpse of Douglas if he returned. The mystery deepened, but Miss Marple's steady hand and keen eyes promised that the truth, no matter how well concealed, would not stay hidden forever. As twilight wrapped Lydney Parva in a cloak of shadows, the village held its breath, unaware that the sharp-eyed old lady in the garden was quietly piecing together the secrets that would soon unravel their peaceful facade. Miss Marple's footsteps were soft on the worn path as she approached the modest post office the next morning, a chill in the air hinting at the early whispers of autumn. The village was just beginning to stir, the faint sounds of carts rolling over cobblestones mingling with the low hum of gossip drifting from the bakery nearby. She paused a moment before the window, watching as Millie Thorne arranged bundles of letters with the precision of a watchmaker. There was a quiet dignity in Millie's movements, though the recent turmoil had left a subtle heaviness in her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Millie greeted warmly, her smile a little more guarded than usual. "Back again, I see." "Good morning, Millie. I hope you don't mind if I ask a few more questions," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. The post office was cramped and fragrant with the mingling scents of paper and ink, but it felt like a sanctuary of routine in the midst of unrest. "Of course, dear. Anything to help." Millie's hands rested on the counter, fingers interlaced. Miss Marple studied her for a moment. "I'm particularly interested in the letters Douglas Mayhew sent or received before the fete. Did you notice anything unusual about his correspondence?" Millie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He was quite private, never discussing his letters much. But there was one, marked urgent, that he collected the day before the fete. He seemed anxious, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone was watching. Did you happen to see the sender's name?" Millie shook her head. "No, I was too busy, and Douglas was in a hurry. But the letter was thick." He unfolded it carefully, almost reverently. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did you happen to see where he went after collecting it?" "I think he went straight to the stables. He was there for quite some time. Then he left in a rush, looking more troubled than ever." The pieces fell into place gently in Miss Marple's mind. The mysterious parcel, the urgent letter, the strange behavior. Something was being concealed, a secret Douglas feared deeply. But what? "I appreciate your help, Millie," Miss Marple said kindly as she prepared to leave. "If you remember anything else, no matter how small, please do let me know." Millie nodded, watching her go with a mix of gratitude and concern. Outside, the village carried on with its quiet rhythms, but Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. If Douglas had received an urgent letter from someone unknown, it suggested that the past he sought to escape was more complicated and dangerous than it seemed. Her next visit was to the home of Beatrice Clegg's niece, Clarissa Price, a woman in her mid-30s whose sharp features bore the faint traces of recent tears. Clarissa had been one of the first to arrive after the tragedy and had quickly become entwined in the village's unfolding drama. Clarissa greeted Miss Marple with a nervous smile, leading her into a sitting room where lace curtains filtered the morning light. The room was tidy, but there was a restless energy in the air. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," Clarissa said softly. "I wish the circumstances were different." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "I understand you were close to your aunt." "Yes, in a way. She was difficult at times, but she cared deeply. I'm hoping to understand who might have wished her harm." Clarissa's eyes flicked to the mantelpiece, where a faded photograph showed Beatrice with a stern expression, her posture erect as if guarding some unseen fortress. "Did your aunt have any recent disputes? Anyone who might have held a grudge?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone casual but intent. Clarissa hesitated. "There were a few. She was quite outspoken about the village council's decisions, especially concerning the new housing development. Some people didn't like her interference." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the new housing development, was it controversial?" "Very. Some villagers feared it would ruin the character of Lydney Parva. Others saw it as a necessary change. My aunt was adamant about preserving the village's history and nature. The familiar tension between progress and preservation was often a fertile ground for resentment." "Did your aunt have any close friends or confidants here?" Miss Marple asked. "Not many. She preferred to keep her circle small, mostly involved in the local historical society, but she did meet regularly with a group of women who shared her passion for the village's heritage." Miss Marple made a mental note to look into this group. As their conversation drew to a close, Clarissa's voice dropped. "There's something else, Miss Marple. On the night before the fete, Aunt Beatrice mentioned receiving a visitor. She wouldn't say who, but she seemed unsettled afterward. Did she say anything more?" "No, only that it was someone she hadn't seen in a very long time." The phrase echoed in Miss Marple's mind. A visitor, long absent, reappearing at a critical moment. Could this visitor be the gruff-voiced stranger the villagers spoke of? Or perhaps connected to Douglas's mysterious parcel and letter? Leaving Clarissa's house, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tighten around the village, like creeping ivy. Her footsteps soon carried her to the village library, a small, book-lined refuge where Mrs. Agnes Wilcox, the librarian, was arranging new arrivals. Agnes was a woman of sharp intellect and impeccable discretion, qualities Miss Marple valued highly. "Good morning, Agnes," Miss Marple greeted, receiving a warm smile in return. "I've heard the village is in quite a state," Agnes said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Any new insights from your investigations?" "Perhaps. I'm particularly interested in Beatrice Clegg's recent activities and any connections she may have had. I understand she was active in the Historical Society?" "Yes, she was," Agnes replied. "They meet weekly on Thursday evenings. A devoted group, mostly older women passionate about preserving the village's past." "Do you know if anything unusual happened at their recent meetings?" Agnes paused. There was some tension. Beatrice wanted to push for a stricter stance against the housing development, but others felt it was time to compromise. I heard whispers of arguments, but nothing that seemed threatening. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Whispers often carry more truth than loud declarations, don't they?" Agnes nodded, glancing down at a notebook filled with careful records. There was also talk of a visitor, an unfamiliar man seen around the village in the days leading up to the fete. No one could place him, but his presence unsettled some. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This mysterious stranger was emerging as a figure linked to both the victim and the village's undercurrents of fear. "Thank you, Agnes. Your insight is invaluable." As she left the library, the sun breaking through the clouds illuminated the village in a soft golden light. Yet beneath the warmth, a chill lingered in the air, an unspoken warning that the calm was fragile and the truth still elusive. Miss Marple's mind returned to Douglas Mayhew's parcel, the urgent letter, and now the visitor Beatrice had feared. Each piece was a thread woven into the tapestry of the village's secret history, and only by patiently unraveling each could she hope to reveal the face behind the voice that did not match. As the day stretched onward, she felt the quiet certainty that the shadows cloaking Lydney Parver's peaceful facade were ready to be lifted, though the cost might be greater than anyone anticipated. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the mysterious visitor and the shadow of unease he had cast over the village, but it was the silence around him that unsettled her most. There was something not quite right about a man so unfamiliar, yet so quietly watched. The village's collective memory seemed to shun him, yet at the same time, their gazes betrayed a mixture of curiosity and dread. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself retracing the steps of the fete, guided by a quiet intuition that the answers lay hidden among the details overlooked by others. The village green, now a little faded and trampled from the previous day's events, bore the remnants of colourful bunting and scattered petals. She paused near the old oak tree where Beatrice had first called out to the stranger. It was an unassuming place, but in its stillness, she felt the echoes of the moment, the hesitation, the surprise, and then the sudden collapse. As she looked around, a familiar figure approached, Constable Peter Hargreaves. He was a tall man with a direct manner, the kind who believed in facts over feelings, yet he carried an air of respect for the elderly lady before him. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat. "I was hoping I might catch you. I've had another look at the stables where Douglas was seen the day before the fete." "Good, Peter. Any new findings?" "Not exactly new, but some things didn't add up earlier. For one, Douglas's horse seemed unusually restless that afternoon. The stable hand told me he'd been pacing, neighing more than usual, something out of character." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Animals do sense things beyond our understanding. Did you find anything unusual in the stable itself?" Peter shook his head. No signs of forced entry or struggle. But there was a faint smell, something sweet, like almonds. The stable hand said it wasn't typical. "Cyanide," Miss Marple murmured under her breath, the word barely audible but heavy with implication. Peter's eyebrows rose. "Poison? You think someone tried to harm the horse, or used it as a means to unsettle Douglas? A threat, perhaps?" She paused, glancing toward the village. "Tell me, Peter, have you noticed anyone watching the stables? Any unfamiliar faces?" Peter hesitated. "There was a man, a stranger, lurking near the edge of the woods the day before the fete. No one could identify him, and when approached, he disappeared into the trees." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "The same stranger the villagers have whispered about?" Peter nodded. "We're trying to track him, but no one seems to know who he is or where he came from." The puzzle pieces began to fit more tightly. The visitor Beatrice feared, the parcel Douglas received, the strange man lurking near the stables, all threads woven into the village's tense fabric. "Thank you, Peter. Keep me informed." After the constable left, Miss Marple made her way to the village pub, the Fox and Hound, where the hum of voices and the clinking of glasses created a lively backdrop. The pub was a known gathering spot, for villagers to share news, often exaggerated, sometimes truthful, but always revealing the undercurrents of local life. Inside, she found Harold Fitch, the landlord, polishing a glass behind the bar. He was a man with a round face and a jovial disposition, but recent events had etched lines of concern around his eyes. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! Here to drown. In sorrow or just a friendly chat?" Harold joked, though the edge of worry was clear. "Neither, Harold. I'm hoping for a chat. I understand some of the villagers saw a stranger before the fete." Harold nodded. "Aye, that they did. A grim sort of fellow, all dark coats and glances that could chill your marrow. Not one of us, that's for certain." "Did anyone approach him?" Not many dared. Some said he asked for Douglas Mayhew by name, but no one's sure if that's true. After a bit of talk, he vanished like a ghost. Miss Marple smiled gently. And the voice? Did anyone hear it? Harold's brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, someone said it was a man's voice, but deep, rough, almost like a growl. Didn't match the face they thought they saw. The words brought a shiver to Miss Marple's spine. The voice that didn't match the face, an uncanny echo of the tale that had first unsettled the village. Her eyes scanned the room, noting faces familiar and new. At a corner table sat Elsie Marsh, the village gossip, who whispered with a small circle about every secret, every slight. Miss Marple approached her quietly. "Elsie, might I have a word?" she asked, sitting opposite the woman. Elsie's eyes sparkled with barely concealed excitement. "Miss Marple, you're the only one who can make sense of this mess. What have you heard about the stranger?" "Only what others have seen and heard." "Tell me, Elsie, did anyone notice anything unusual about the stranger's behavior? Or perhaps anything he left behind?" Elsie nodded eagerly. "There was a scarf caught on a thorn bush near the old mill path. It was dark, but with a faint scent. Lavender, I think. Odd, isn't it, for a man?" Miss Marple's mind raced. A man with a voice that did not match his face, carrying a scarf scented with lavender, a small but telling detail. It hinted at someone trying to disguise himself, or someone with secrets layered beneath appearances. "Thank you, Elsie. This could be important." As she stepped back outside, the village's shadows lengthened under the sinking sun. The mystery deepened with every passing hour. The hidden visitor, the secret letters, the poisoned stable, and the strange scarf all weaving a tangled web around the village. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her quaint cottage, where the warmth of a fire and the soft ticking of a clock offered a comforting rhythm amid the turmoil. She sat by the window, sipping tea, her keen eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Her thoughts returned to Beatrice's last days, to the weight of old grudges, and to the man whose voice did not match his face. Each new detail was a step closer to the truth, yet the final picture remained obscured. In the quiet, Miss Marple resolved to revisit the Historical Society's meetings and to speak again with those who had known Beatrice best. There was more beneath the surface, hidden in the lives of Lydney Parver's residents. The village, she knew, would not rest until the voice was matched to the face, and justice, quietly but surely, was done. The morning air was crisp when Missy Marple stepped out of her cottage, the faint scent of dew mingling with the earthy aroma of the village gardens. She carried a small notebook in one hand, the pages already filled with observations and questions, but her mind was far from settled. The events of the last days had woven a complex tapestry, threads of fear, secrecy, and hidden motives that demanded careful unraveling. Her first destination was the village hall, where the Historical Society met every Thursday evening. The meetings, she had learned, were often a crucible for opinion and sometimes conflict, especially regarding the upcoming housing development. The hall itself was a modest building, its brick facade softened by climbing ivy, but inside it was warm and buzzing with conversation. Miss Marple arrived shortly before the scheduled meeting, the room still scattered with half-finished cups of tea and chairs arranged in a loose circle. One by one, the members trickled in, mostly older women, their faces marked by years of shared concerns and occasional disagreements. Among them was Margaret Henley, the Society's chairwoman, known for her stern resolve and fierce protection of the village's heritage. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Margaret greeted her with a nod, her eyes sharp but welcoming. "We were expecting you." "Thank you, Margaret. I hope you don't mind if I observe today's discussion." "Not at all. We could use an extra perspective, especially with all that has happened." The meeting began with the usual reports on conservation efforts and plans for upcoming events, but as the discussion turned to Beatrice Clegg's recent involvement, the atmosphere subtly shifted. There was a palpable tension as voices grew quieter, more cautious. "I must say," Margaret began, "Beatrice was quite passionate about opposing the new development. She believed it threatened not just our landscape but the very soul of Lydney Parva." Several members murmured assent, but one voice, soft, yet firm, offered a counterpoint. "Perhaps, but progress is inevitable. Some compromises must be made." Miss Marple noted the tension in the room, sensing that more than mere disagreement lay beneath the surface. As the conversation continued, an elderly woman named Edith Lowe spoke up hesitantly. "Beatrice was troubled in the weeks before the fete. She confided in me that she'd seen someone, an old acquaintance, she said, someone she hadn't expected to see again." "Did she say who?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No," Edith replied, shaking her head. "Only that it stirred up old memories and old fears." She seemed afraid. The mention of fear drew a murmur through the room. Miss Marple's eyes met Margaret's briefly, who gave a slight nod. It was clear Beatrice's visitor was no casual passerby. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered to speak with Margaret privately. "Do you think this visitor might have something to do with the letter Douglas Mayhew received?" Margaret pursed her lips thoughtfully. "It's possible. Beatrice and Douglas had a complicated history. There were rumors of a falling out years ago, though none of us knew the details. Do you know if Douglas ever mentioned the visitor or the letter to you?" "No. Douglas was a private man. If he was involved, he kept it to himself." Miss Marple thanked Margaret and left, her mind weaving together the strands of past grievances and present dangers. The visitor, it seemed, was a living link to a history the village preferred to keep buried. Her next call was on Douglas Mayhew himself, or rather, his residence. The small cottage at the edge of the village looked tidy, but weathered. A garden choked with weeds hinting at neglect. As she approached, a man emerged from the shadows, a younger man, perhaps in his late 30s, with a wary gaze that flicked to her before he stepped forward. "Miss Marple," he said cautiously. "I wasn't expecting another visitor. I hoped you might speak with me, Douglas. There are questions only you can answer." He regarded her silently for a moment, then nodded. "Very well." Inside, the cottage was sparse but orderly. Douglas settled into a chair by the fire, rubbing his hands together as if to steady his nerves. "Tell me about the letter you received before the fete," Miss Marple began. Douglas's face darkened. "It came from someone I thought I'd left behind. Someone tied to a past I wanted to forget. The letter threatened to expose secrets that would ruin more than my reputation." "Did Beatrice Clegg know about these secrets?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, but she was involved too. We shared a history, a bitter one, filled with mistakes and betrayals." "What kind of mistakes?" Douglas hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Years ago, before either of us came to Lydney Parva, there was an incident, a crime. We were young, reckless, and the consequences still haunt me." Miss Marple listened intently, feeling the weight of his confession. "And the visitor Beatrice feared?" "A man from that time," Douglas said bitterly, "someone who believes we owe him a debt he intends to collect." The conversation confirmed her suspicions. The past had returned not as a memory, but as a threat. Leaving Douglas's cottage, Miss Marple felt a chill despite the rising sun. The village's peaceful surface masked turbulent waters that threatened to swallow them all if left unchecked. She decided to visit the old mill path where the lavender-scented scarf had been found. The path wound through tangled undergrowth, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and moss. As she picked her way along the trail, she imagined the visitors' hurried steps, the nervous glances, the hidden intentions. Near a thorn bush, she found the scarf exactly as Elsie had described, a dark fabric faintly perfumed. Gently she picked it up, noting the delicate weave and the lingering scent. Someone had been careful to leave a trace, but why? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustle. Turning, she saw a figure standing a short distance away, an elderly man, his face weathered, but eyes sharp and clear. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought I might find you here." "Mr. Graves," she said, recognizing the village's long-time retired magistrate. "What brings you to the mill path?" "I've been reviewing some old case files," he replied. "Cases that might shed light on the present troubles." Curiosity sparked, Miss Marple asked, "May I see them?" Together they walked back to his modest home where stacks of dusty folders awaited. As they sifted through the records, a pattern emerged. An unresolved case from decades ago, involving a betrayal, a disappearance, and a man whose name matched the stranger recently seen. The pieces were aligning. The visitor was no stranger at all, but a revenant from a painful past, demanding reckoning. That evening, as twilight deepened and shadows lengthened, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, the quiet of the village punctuated by distant calls of nightbirds. The mystery had grown sharper, but so had the dangers. The voice that did not match the face was no longer just a riddle. It was a summons for justice, for truth, and for the peace the village so desperately needed. And Miss Marple knew the next steps would lead her ever closer to unveiling the secret that had haunted Lydney Parva for too long. The next morning dawned pale and misty, the kind of morning that softened edges and muffled sounds, an atmosphere that suited the village's mood perfectly. Lydney Parva was still caught in a swirl of quiet apprehension, the murder of Beatrice Clegg casting a long shadow over the cottages and lanes where life had once seemed so untroubled. As Miss Marple brewed her tea, her thoughts lingered on the revelations from the previous day. The visitor from the past, the old case files, the tangled relationships, all pieces of a puzzle that now felt more intricate than ever. With a sense of purpose, she resolved to visit the last person who had seen Beatrice alive, the florist Mrs. Elsie Hargreaves. Elsie's shop was a cheerful burst of colour on the village square, with pots of lavender, roses and daisies spilling onto the pavement. Yet behind the bright facade, Elsie's face was lined with worry. "Miss Marple," she greeted, her voice soft and a little shaky. "I've been expecting you. I wanted to ask you about the day of the fete," Miss Marple began gently. "You mentioned hearing a voice that didn't quite match the face. Could you tell me more?" Elsie nodded, motioning for Miss Marple to sit among the blooms. "It was strange, truly strange. I was arranging flowers near the bandstand when I heard someone speaking behind me. The voice was calm, familiar even, but when I turned, the face didn't fit. It was as if I was hearing Beatrice's husband but looking at a stranger." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Did you recognize the voice clearly?" "Yes, I was sure. But the man I saw was younger, dressed differently, and there was something unsettling in his eyes. I can't explain it, like a mask that didn't quite hide what was beneath." The image lingered with Miss Marple, the unsettling discord between voice and appearance echoing her own sense of unease. She thanked Elsie and stepped back into the street, her mind racing. Her next stop was the village pub, the Silver Thistle, where locals gathered to exchange news and theories. The room was dim but warm, filled with murmurs and sidelong glances as she entered. At the bar, Constable Peter Bramley was deep in conversation with the landlord, Mr. Harris. "Good morning." "Constable," Miss Marple said, joining them. "Any new developments?" Peter looked up, his face grave. "We've been going through Beatrice's letters and diaries. There's a recurring mention of a man named Caleb. No surname, no address, just Caleb. She seemed troubled by him." "Did Douglas mention Caleb to you?" Miss Marple asked. Peter shook his head. "Not at all. We're trying to track down who this Caleb might be." Miss Marple pondered this. Caleb, could this be the visitor? The man from the past stirring old fears. It seemed likely. As she prepared to leave, a young woman approached hesitantly. It was Alice Crane, the school teacher. Her eyes were red-rimmed and anxious. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I thought you might want to see this." She handed over a small envelope, sealed but unmarked. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased, of a younger Beatrice with a man whose face was partly shadowed but unmistakably severe. "Do you know who he is?" Alice asked. Miss Marple studied the photo carefully. "I believe this is the man Beatrice feared, the one she referred to in her letters and feared would return. His name is Caleb," Alice added, "and he used to live near here, long ago. There were whispers that he disappeared after a scandal, but no one knew for sure." Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. Caleb was the thread tying together Beatrice's fears, the old case and the mystery visitor. But what was his purpose in returning now? And what had led him to Beatrice? Determined to learn more, she decided to visit Caleb's old home at the edge of the village, a dilapidated cottage that had been empty for years. The path was overgrown, wild roses choking the fence, but the structure still stood, its windows dark and hollow. As she examined the exterior, a sudden sound made her turn, a soft footstep behind her. It was Douglas Mayhew, appearing out of the mist as though summoned by the same questions. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I came to look for answers too." Together, they pushed open the gate, the creak startling in the stillness. Inside, the cottage bore the signs of neglect and abandonment, dusty shelves, broken furniture, and papers strewn across the floor. Yet something caught Miss Marple's eye, a scrap of folded paper tucked beneath a floorboard. Carefully, she unfolded it. It was a letter penned in a hurried hand, filled with angry accusations and threats. The words spoke of betrayal, debts, unpaid, and a reckoning long overdue. Douglas's face tightened. "That letter confirms it. Caleb never left us alone, not truly." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple and Douglas searched the cottage for more clues. They found an old journal, its pages yellowed with age, chronicling a bitter feud between Caleb and several villagers, among them Douglas himself. The journal revealed a history of greed, jealousy, and vengeance, painting Caleb as a man consumed by a desire to settle old scores regardless of the cost. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "This is the heart of the matter, Douglas. Caleb's return was no accident. He came seeking justice in his own way, but in doing so, he unleashed old wounds that never healed." The weight of this truth settled over them as twilight deepened. The village's calm had been shattered not by random violence, but by the reckoning of a past that refused to remain buried. That evening, back in her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The pieces were falling into place, the mysterious visitor, the voice that did not match the face, the threats, and the long-hidden grudges. Yet one question lingered. Who had truly silenced Beatrice? The answer, she knew, lay just beyond the next revelation, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover it. As the dawn crept over Lydney Parva, the village remained cloaked in a sombre stillness. Miss Marple sat by her window, the morning light casting gentle patterns on the lace curtains. Her thoughts were a steady swirl of the facts uncovered and the shadows still lurking. The dusty cottage, the torn letter, and the bitter journal had opened a window into Caleb's world. But the identity of the man who had come to the fete, the voice that didn't match the face, and the fatal act against Beatrice still demanded clarity. Miss Marple's tea grew cold as she contemplated the intricate web binding everyone in this small village. The previous day's discoveries had shown her that old grievances, once buried, could erupt with devastating force. But what she knew with certainty was this: the key lay not in the dusty pages of history alone, but in the present, among those who still wore the masks of civility. Douglas Mayhew was due to visit shortly. Their last encounter in Caleb's abandoned home had been a revelation of the bitterness that had festered over years, but she sensed he too was a man caught in a tangle far deeper than simple family resentments. When the doorbell rang, she opened it to find him already pale and tense, his eyes revealing sleepless nights. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "I've been thinking about what you said last evening, that Caleb's return was no accident." She nodded, motioning him to sit. "It rarely is, Douglas. I wonder, though, what if Caleb's return was a guise? What if the man seen at the fete was using Caleb's shadow to conceal himself?" Douglas frowned. "You mean someone pretending to be him? Or at least assuming his role," Miss Marple replied. "That voice you said you didn't recognize, yet Elsie heard, there's a story beneath that, I'm certain." Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to reveal Constable Bramley, who looked unusually grave. "Miss Marple, there's been a development at the vicarage," he announced. "You'd best see this for yourself." Together, they made their way to the vicarage, the village's spiritual centre, and a place usually filled with calm. But today a cluster of villagers had gathered outside, whispering anxiously. Inside they found Reverend Samuel Pike standing beside a sideboard, his hand trembling as he held a small box. "It was hidden in the vestry," the vicar explained. "I found it this morning behind a loose panel in the wall." Miss Marple carefully opened the box. Inside lay an old phonograph record and a faded letter. The letter was brittle but legible, written in a neat hand. "To the one who dares disturb the past, know that the truth you seek will sound a voice never meant to be heard." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she carefully lifted the record. It was an odd artifact in a village so untouched by time, and yet it hinted at the story of the voice, a voice that had haunted the fete. Back at her home, she placed the record on her old gramophone, letting the needle drop gently onto the vinyl surface. A crackle gave way to a faint, unmistakable voice. It was smooth, commanding, and chillingly familiar. It spoke in riddles about debts owed and promises broken, words meant to unsettle and warn. Miss Marple listened intently, the voice threading a sinister undertone through the village's calm facade. "The man on that record," she murmured, "is Caleb himself, or someone who has studied him well." Douglas, who had accompanied her, looked troubled. "If the man at the fete was not Caleb, but mimicking him, then who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is the question." Their attention returned to the letter. There was a clue hidden within its carefully penned words, a reference to a meeting at the old mill on the night of the fete. That location was long abandoned, a relic of the village's past industry. Curious and compelled, Miss Marple and Douglas decided to visit the mill, hoping to uncover what secrets might still linger in the shadows of its crumbling walls. The air was thick with damp and decay as they approached, the skeletal frame silhouetted against the overcast sky. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of loose beams. Amid the rubble, Miss Marple's keen eye caught the faint imprint of footsteps leading toward a hidden alcove. There, tucked behind fallen planks, lay a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. With care, she unfolded it to reveal a collection of letters and photographs. They detailed clandestine meetings, financial transactions, and threats exchanged between villagers, some of whom Miss Marple had met personally. One letter, in particular, caught her eye. It was addressed to Douglas Mayhew, penned in a hand she recognized from Caleb's journal. Douglas's face paled. "I don't remember receiving this." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. It seems Caleb's grudge was closer to home than you realized. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the mill. Miss Marple and Douglas exchanged a glance. They were no longer alone. Emerging from the shadows came a figure they both recognized. Thomas Everard, the village solicitor. His usual, composed demeanor was replaced by a grim determination. "I suppose you found my little hideaway," he said quietly. "It seems the past refuses to stay buried." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Thomas, why all the secrecy? What is your connection to Caleb?" He hesitated, then spoke. "Caleb was my brother. Our family has carried the weight of his misdeeds for years. I came here to gather proof, evidence, that could protect the village from his legacy. But it seems someone wanted to keep these secrets hidden, no matter the cost." The revelation sent a ripple through Miss Marple's mind. The tangled family ties, the false voice, the hidden documents, all pieces of a puzzle far more complex than she had imagined. As the day wore on, the village buzzed with renewed speculation. The solicitor's confession had shifted suspicion and deepened the mystery. Miss Marple knew that the next steps had to be careful and deliberate. That evening, as the village settled under a darkening sky, Miss Marple sat quietly, piecing together the threads. She had seen the masks worn by friends and foes alike, heard the voices that didn't quite fit the faces, and now stood on the cusp of unmasking the truth. The final game was about to begin, and only one could emerge unscathed. Miss Marple, with her gentle but relentless insight, prepared to draw out the murderer. One last time. The morning mist still clung lightly to the hedgerows as the villagers gathered at the small hall near the village green. The air was thick with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and something close to dread. Miss Marple had summoned them all here, a quiet determination in her eyes and an unmistakable calm about her manner. She stood before the assembled crowd, who glanced at one another nervously, wondering what the day might bring. Among them were Douglas Mayhew, Thomas Everard, Elsie Calloway, and several other faces who had become central to this tangled tale. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began softly, her gaze sweeping the room. "It is often said that small villages hold no secrets, but as we have seen, even the quietest places can harbour dark truths." A hush fell over the room. The murder of dear Beatrice was not a crime born of passion nor a random act of violence, but rather a carefully concealed truth that grew out of fear, deception, and a desperate attempt to protect a secret. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The man whose voice did not match his face, the figure who caused so much confusion at the fete, was none other than Douglas Mayhew. A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Douglas's face drained of colour. Miss Marple continued, "Douglas, you are a man burdened by guilt and haunted by your family's shadow. Your sister's disappearance, your father's ruin, these were wounds you sought to heal in the only way you knew. When Caleb Mayhew returned, claiming a right to a legacy you thought lost, you feared exposure. You disguised yourself to unsettle the village, to divert attention. And when Beatrice threatened to reveal what she knew, you silenced her." Douglas shook his head, voice trembling. "No, it wasn't meant to be like this. She found the letters, the proof of our family's shame. I only wanted to stop her from ruining what little peace I had left." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "But in doing so, you underestimated the resilience of the village and the quiet power of observation." She turned to Thomas Everard. "And you, Thomas, knew more than you admitted, hoping to protect your family name but never truly acting against your brother's darker impulses." Thomas lowered his eyes, remorse evident in his expression. The torn letter, the hidden documents, the phonograph record, all these were pieces of a puzzle Douglas tried to break apart, but the threads held firm. Miss Marple then addressed the crowd. Justice will be served, but let us remember that human nature is seldom purely good or evil. It is in the shades of grey where tragedy often takes root. As the constable stepped forward to take Douglas into custody, a strange mixture of relief and sorrow filled the room. Later, as the village slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm, Miss Marple sat once again by her window. The mystery was resolved. The voice matched its face, and yet the echoes of the past lingered on, quiet reminders of how even the gentlest places could hold the darkest secrets. With a small, knowing smile, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring complexity of human hearts and the quiet strength of a woman who never ceased to watch, listen, and understand.